Welcome to our deep dive into China's economic miracle. We've got some really fascinating stuff to dig into today, a whole stack of research papers, excerpts from Lan Xiaohuan's book. It's called Inside the Game, The Chinese Government and Economic Development. And we've even got a snippet of an interview with the author himself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we're on a mission here to try to understand how the Chinese government has shaped its economic trajectory. And it looks like they've taken a very different route than a lot of so-called developed nations. One of the things that really jumped out at me right away was this idea of like direct government involvement in the economy. It's like they're not just setting the rules of the game, they're actually like down on the field playing the game. What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's really striking, I think, when you contrast it with Western models, where government involvement is often more kind of hands-off. It's more about setting policy and regulations and creating a level playing field for businesses to compete. But in China, it's much more direct. We're talking state-owned enterprises, state-owned banks, and a government that really actively attracts investment, manages land resources, and spearheads these large-scale projects that the private sector might shy away from.
So they're practically building the economy brick by brick. It's really different from that, invisible hand approach we hear about in the West. So what are the downsides to this level of government involvement?
Well, one potential downside is, the risk that comes with having so many eggs in one basket. If the government makes a miscalculation, the consequences can be pretty widespread. And then there's the question of efficiency and innovation. Can a top-down approach really foster that dynamism and creativity that often drives economic growth?
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the long-term sustainability of this model. But I mean, for now, it seems to have worked incredibly well. They've achieved phenomenal growth in a relatively short period of time. Let's talk about the 1994 tax sharing reform. This seemed to have a huge impact on local governments and how they finance development.
Oh, absolutely. This reform was a real game changer. Essentially, it shifted a large chunk of tax revenue to the central government, which left local governments scrambling to find new ways to fund their projects.
So it's like if your parents suddenly told you you're responsible for all your own expenses, how did those local governments cope with this financial pressure?
They got creative. They turned to something called land finance. It's a system where they leverage their control over land to generate revenue. We see them selling land use rights to developers and using land as collateral to secure bank loans for all sorts of development projects.
So that sounds risky. What happens if the real estate bubble bursts? Could this trigger some kind of domino effect across the whole Chinese economy?
That's the billion yuan question. This reliance on land finance has created this complex web of interconnected risks, linking land prices, local government finances, infrastructure investment, and overall economic growth. It's a system with some inherent vulnerabilities for sure.
It's like a high-stakes game they're playing. While we're on the topic of interconnectedness, this idea of the boundary effect really caught my eye. The observation that areas along those administrative borders, especially provincial borders, often lag behind in economic development.
Yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon.
Okay.
Think about the challenges those border areas face. Often they have limited resources, geographic barriers, sometimes even cultural differences, and they're usually further away from major urban centers, which are the economic hubs. All of that can really hinder development.
It's like being stuck in no man's land, both geographically and economically.
However,
Mm.
China is actively trying to address these boundary-related challenges. There's a big push for regional integration with major infrastructure projects connecting different regions and encouraging economic collaboration.
So it's like they're trying to erase those boundaries, both physically and economically. I can see how that could boost development in those lagging areas. In a system as vast as China's, I imagine managing information and aligning incentives must be a constant headache. You've got this tension between the formal authority at the top and the real authority, often wielded by those on the ground who have, the actual knowledge. How does that play out?
It's a key dynamic to understand. In any large organization, and especially one as immense as the Chinese government, managing information flow and aligning incentives were absolutely crucial.
Because the folks at the top might be drawing up the grand plans, but it's the people on the ground who see what's actually working and what needs to be adjusted.
Precisely. And this becomes even more critical in a country as diverse and dynamic as China, with its vast regional variations, differing economic conditions, and even cultural nuances that influence how policies are implemented and received on the ground.
So it's not just about having information, it's about understanding the nuances, the local context, and adapting to those complexities.
Yeah, it's not just about having the data points. It's about understanding the local context and being able to adapt to those complexities.
And Lan Xiaohuan really emphasizes this concept of real authority, right? Like the real authority resides with those who hold the key information. Can you give us some real-world examples of how this plays out in China's economic development?
Sure, so think about it like this. The central government might set a target for, infrastructure spending, but it's the local officials who decide which specific projects get prioritized, who gets the contracts, how the money's actually spent. Their decisions are shaped by their understanding of local needs, but also by local politics and incentives.
So it's a system that requires a high degree of trust and accountability. But let's go back to this concept of land finance for a second.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier that it's kind of like walking a tightrope. What are some of the specific risks involved?
Absolutely. One of the key concerns is that this heavy dependence on land sales for revenue has inflated this massive real estate bubble in a lot of Chinese cities. And if property prices were to plummet, local governments could find themselves saddled with enormous debts and a shrinking tax base.
Is that Jenga tower we were talking about?
Exactly. And this brings us to an important distinction that Lan Xiaohuan makes in his book, the difference between land finance and land financing.
Okay, I'm a little fuzzy on that distinction. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. So think of land finance as the direct revenue that local governments get from selling land use rights to developers. It's a quick cash injection. But land financing is a bit more complex. It involves using that land as collateral to secure loans from banks, often to fund those big infrastructure projects that we were talking about earlier.
So it's like taking out a mortgage on your house to finance a home renovation?
Exactly. And this highlights another really crucial aspect of China's economic system, which is the dominant role of state-owned banks. These banks are often more willing to lend to local governments, even for projects that might be considered risky by private banks, because there's this implicit guarantee from the government.
So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, both sides relying on each other to keep the system running.
Right. But this also creates a situation where the lines between government finances and the banking system become blurred, which raises concerns about transparency and potential conflicts of interest.
It sounds like a system that can generate really impressive growth, but also one that requires really careful management and a high tolerance for risk. One thing that really struck me in the research was how even in a system as centralized as China's, there's this constant tension between the formal authority of the central government and the real authority that's exercised by those on the ground. It's that information gap we talked about earlier.
Yeah, that tension is a recurring theme in Lan Xiaohuan's work. He argues that in any large and complex organization, and especially one as vast as the Chinese government, managing information flow and aligning incentives are absolutely paramount.
Because the people at the top might be the ones setting the overall direction, but it's the folks on the ground who have their fingers on the pulse. They're the ones who see what's actually working and what needs to be adjusted.
And this is particularly important in a country as diverse and dynamic as China. You have enormous regional variations, different economic conditions, even cultural differences that impact how policies are implemented and received.
It's not just about having a blueprint. It's about understanding the nuances of the landscape and being able to adapt to that ever-changing terrain. So how has the Chinese government tried to address this challenge of bridging the gap between top-down directives and bottom-up feedback?
They've experimented with various approaches. One method has been to decentralize certain decision-making powers, giving local governments more autonomy to tailor policies to their specific circumstances.
Okay, that makes sense. Give the people closest to the situation more control over the levers. But doesn't that create the potential for inconsistency and lack of coordination?
It certainly does, and that's why we see this constant back and forth between centralization and decentralization in China's economic management. They're trying to strike that delicate balance between control and flexibility.
To complicate things even further, China is undergoing this massive economic transformation right now, shifting from an investment-driven growth model to one that's more reliant on domestic consumption. So how does this transition factor into this dynamic between central and local authorities?
It adds another layer of complexity. This shift towards a consumption-based economy requires a different set of skills and priorities from local governments. It's less about building factories and more about creating an environment where people feel confident and secure enough to spend their money.
So things like investing in education, healthcare, social safety nets, basically improving the overall quality of life for people.
Exactly, and this requires local governments to be much more responsive to the needs and aspirations of their citizens. It's about shifting from a production-oriented mindset to a more service-oriented one.
It's like they're being asked to switch from playing offense to playing defense.
That's a great analogy, and this transition isn't just about economic policies, it's also about changing mindsets and expectations at all levels of government.
That sounds like a monumental task, especially given the sheer size and complexity of China. What are some of the key challenges they're facing in making this transition?
One of the biggest challenges is reforming the hukou system, which is a household registration system that ties people's access to social services to their place of birth. This system has created a vast internal migrant population who often lack access to healthcare, education, and other benefits in the cities where they work.
So it's almost like a modern-day caste system
Yep.
that limits social mobility and creates inequality.
It's a system that was designed for a different era when China's economy was primarily agrarian. But in today's urbanized and interconnected society, it's become a major obstacle to achieving inclusive and sustainable growth.
And addressing this hukou issue isn't just about social justice. It's also about unlocking the economic potential of millions of people who are currently marginalized.
Precisely, by providing these migrant workers with better access to education, healthcare, and social security, China can unleash a new wave of consumer demand and create a more dynamic and innovative economy.
So it sounds like this hukou reform is a really crucial piece of the puzzle if China wants to successfully navigate this transition to a consumption-driven economy.
It's certainly one of the most significant challenges, but it's not the only one. China also needs to address issues like rising income inequality, environmental degradation, and a growing debt burden.
And all of these challenges are intertwined with the dynamics between central and local governments, the flow of information and the alignment of incentives.
Absolutely. As China continues on this path of economic development, it's a story that will continue to unfold in fascinating and often unpredictable ways.
China's economic model is incredibly complex, with its own unique set of strengths and vulnerabilities. It makes you wonder if other countries, especially those facing similar development challenges, can learn anything from China's experience.
That's a question that a lot of policymakers and economists around the world are grappling with. China's economic miracle has certainly captured global attention, but it's important to remember that their success has been shaped by a very particular set of historical, political, and cultural factors.
Right. It's not a simple recipe that can be easily replicated elsewhere.
Exactly. There's no China-in-a-box solution. One of the key insights from Lan Xiaohuan's work is that understanding those underlying factors, the information flows, the incentive structures, the unique role of the government, is crucial for assessing the applicability of China's model to other contexts.
Yeah, you have to look beyond the surface level successes and really dig into the why behind the what. Blindly clipping what China has done without considering those deeper dynamics is unlikely to yield the same results.
And it's crucial to remember that China's economic journey is far from over. They're still grappling with a whole host of challenges: rising inequality, environmental concerns, the need to transition to a more sustainable and innovation-driven growth model. How they navigate these challenges will have profound implications, not just for China, but for the global economy as a whole.
It feels like they're in the middle of writing the next chapter of this economic saga, and we're all eagerly waiting to see how it unfolds.
One of the most compelling aspects of this story, I think, is that it challenges a lot of our assumptions about how economies develop. It demonstrates that there isn't a single path to success, and that different models can work, even those that deviate from traditional Western paradigms.
It's a good reminder to stay open to new ideas, learn from diverse experiences, and constantly question our own assumptions about how the world operates.
And ultimately, that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not just about understanding China's economy. It's about broadening our perspectives on development, on the role of government, and on that complex interplay of forces that shape our world.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? We've seen how China's economic miracle has been deeply intertwined with the role of its government, often in ways that challenge conventional economic thinking. It's a story of remarkable growth, but also of complex interdependencies and potential vulnerabilities. Here's something to chew on. How might China's approach to economic development, with its emphasis on government involvement, offer lessons or even warnings for other nations grappling with similar challenges? Food for thought as you continue your own explorations. This has been your deep dive into China's economic development. Thanks for joining us.